live. Hi, everyone. Our first official WISE live stream. Thank you for joining us for this. I'm going to give a little bit of an intro, and then we're going to have a conversation. So, in 2021, WISE celebrated 50 years. And in honor of the milestone, we reached out to our community to hear the stories from all the people that have worked together throughout those years to shape us. A collaboration with Northern Stage allowed us to create a podcast to share those stories with you all. Jess Chayes, former Bold Associate Artistic Director, right?
That's it.
At Northern Stage, interviewed 17 of the many influential people of the past 50 years. Together, we created WISER, a podcast of WISE's impact on the Upper Valley. Some of you may have had a chance to listen to it. All of the episodes are available for streaming at wiseuv.org/listen. As each episode was released this spring, we heard all of these themes emerging that have tied us all together and made WISE the organization that we know today. We heard not only about what we do, leading the Upper Valley to end gender-based violence, but also the way that WISE has gone about doing our work that has resonated across these decades. And we just kept thinking that there's so much more to talk about. So I'm thrilled to have the opportunity to chat tonight with Jess, who interviewed and produced the WISER podcast, and Peggy O'Neill, Executive Director at WISE for almost 20 years. I'm Kate Rohdenburg, the Program Director at WISE. This is the first time we've been able to gather together and talk about what we heard and learned. And we're so excited. Thank you all for joining us. We are going to keep an eye on the chat. So please share your questions and comments and reflections with each other. We'll try to answer some as we go. And the first major theme that really came up that was so powerful throughout the podcast is the one about our community. Everything from WISE's inception through this half century has been possible because of the people. So thank you for being our people. And we'd love all of you watching to introduce yourselves to each other in the chat, share who you are, maybe how you're connected with WISE, and get to know the people that are doing this work alongside of us all. So on that topic of community, I was re-listening to the podcast and realized in the first episode, Jess, you say that Northern Stage also's mission is changing lives. And so I've just been thinking about that first most obvious, how both of these organizations are thinking about how do we change lives. At WISE, I think people assume we mean changing the lives of the survivors that we're working with, but I think most often what we hear is that we're changing our own lives and the lives as we come together in community with each other, like all of us are changed. Peggy, you said that in one of the podcasts, that your personal experiences got connected with everyone else's personal experiences at WISE. And Alex and Martha talked about that too, how WISE started just talking about our lives and what was happening and how we can change. So I just think that that's a really sweet place to start, maybe talking a little bit about how we've all experienced that connection with community and coming together at WISE. Do you want to start, Jess? Just because you're the newest?
Definitely, absolutely, yeah. And I felt so lucky to go through this whole process with, a very unique perspective as someone who had obviously heard about WISE through my time in the Upper Valley, but really sort of dove into being a part of WISE during this podcast. I took the Fundamentals of Gender-Based Violence course through WISE, and then that was sort of my, had a long-term collaboration with Betsy at WISE, and so I feel like, it's been really fun to sort of come in from the outside and be immersed. But that was one of the first and most beautiful confluences, is this confluence of mission. For Northern Stage, it's changing lives one story at a time, which I also think, thinking about both the podcast and now this conversation event and this sort of excitement, I think, at WISE around now, having conversations, sharing stories with our community and really, opening up. It just feels like a continuation of the opening up of these experiences of listening to survivors, of violence prevention, through reaching absolutely everyone. I think that's very similar to with Northern Stage. How can we change people's lives through, through the transformative power of stories, and how they have the power to build empathy, to build community. It's not just for, the participants in our plays, but obviously for the audiences, for the young people who come through the education programs. I think we feel similarly that, our hope would be that everyone's lives can be touched by stories. And so, there's just like such a nice resonance between the two organizations, even though the work is very different, and the missions are different, obviously, in some profound ways. I feel like that that similarity and that coming together and sort of using story to inspire, to create empathy, and to connect people to each other is, very much in common. So I love that. Yeah.
Well, I remember when I first reached out to Carol and you, we were hoping to have a live theater event when Northern Stage was going to produce something, a brand new event. And it was that intersection of people's stories and artistry to illuminate the work that WISE does and the important role that the arts have in our community. And then COVID, changed all of us. And as WISE is known to do, as Northern Stage is known to do, you figure out how to do it differently. And that's how this podcast evolved. One of the things, as someone who is older than the two of you, learning, I wouldn't say learning, but finding language and getting language to talk about your experiences was something that was new for me at WISE. Coming to WISE and learning from Kate, Kate's an amazing trainer, and the other staff at WISE, I all of a sudden discovered, had this, just this new world of language that I could access to begin to describe and reframe my experience, my family's experience, the experience of friends and family members. And in that reframing has given me the opportunity to connect with people in such beautiful and meaningful ways. And I think that's really what we're trying to do, is we're trying to give people an opportunity to share what's going on with them, and then for us to listen deeply to what that is.
Abby's actually on right now, and I remember was listening to her episode the other day, and she was talking about I kind of came into this seems like a nice way to give back to my community, I'll help those poor people that are experiencing something bad. And then you get connected to this whole world and realize it's not those people. There are ways that all of us are being impacted, and so many times impacted in ways we couldn't even conceive of, even when it was right in our face, or when people were saying what you're experiencing is violence, and how much we were shutting that down. So I think all the time about how transformative it is to just see it in ourselves, and then all the opportunity that creates to be we're connected with all of us experiencing it together, and all of us having this power now by finding each other.
Absolutely. That reminds me, this is slightly to the side of that, but because the training for me, WISE's training, was transformative. But I remember at the time I was learning about just this cultural obsession with violence, and especially violence against women, and just the amount, and I also remember, we heard in the episode, I think with Abby, about SVU becoming, really popular,
dun,
and
dun, dun.
everyone learning about the issues that way, which is, particular, but realizing that, last about a year ago, that I was working on this. I was literally working on this murder mystery Zoom play for Northern Stage, which was an adaptation of the Jack the Ripper story, which again is this, classic story that lives in our cultural imagination about, basically this man who murders women. And that was profound for me, because again, coming back to the idea of stories, it made me think a lot about the stories that we tell, and what are the stories that they put into our our minds. I mean, you know, if we believe that stories can change our lives and change us, you know, then what are the stories that we're taking in, and what are the stories that we're so used to and that are so prevalent in our culture, and how is that forming us? So, I mean, I think, just an awareness of that as part of my WISE education was amazing, and has definitely something, you know, I've taken with me into my, you know, my theater life and my Northern Stage life, you know, and thinking about, what are the stories that we tell, and how do we sort of retrace some of those pathways in our brains through stories? You know, they can be so powerful and so potent in connecting people, but also, you know, in giving the same old messages over and over and over again. So I don't know.
Yeah, like how often do we go to parties and people are like, oh, that must be so hard what you're doing. And almost every time I'm like, it's incredibly hopeful, joyful work. Like it is a fun work environment. Celine has the loudest laugh I've ever heard. And like it echoes through the building. Like we have this story that domestic and sexual violence is this horrible thing, and it is. And there are these relationships and connections that are being made that are really joyful, and I think hopeful in the sense of like we do know that we can do better.
I think we also, you know, what I've learned through the folks at WISE is what I see as entertainment is completely different. So watching, just to use SVU as the example, you know, it definitely was a TV show that I found entertaining, and it's not a show that I can watch anymore because it plays on these predominant themes of violence against women. And so learning about this work does shape how you find joy and humor. It has shifted a lot for me, and I think it has for the folks who come to WISE. So
interesting.
Yeah. We don't laugh at the same jokes anymore.
Yeah.
No,
but
it's funny,
like
but different jokes.
Yeah. I was like, you laugh, but at different jokes.
Different jokes,
Yeah.
I'm curious about like when I mean, that's a lot of prep work to join a 15-hour training on gender-based violence in order to do this podcast. And was it like what you expected? What do you think you walked differently into the interviews having done that?
Wow. I mean,
sorry, I'm springing that question.
No, that's a great question. And it was, I mean, it's funny you say like joy, like it was not, I don't know if this sounds weird, but I was excited to take the class. I was like, you know, it didn't feel like, oh, you know, I'm going to do this as like homework to do this podcast. I was really excited because I think, I don't know, because WISE is this sort of really revered organization. And I think, you know, one of the other resonances that I always found with Northern Stage is that it's full of passionate people. And I think I was just mostly excited to like get to know more sides of the organization and get to know the people in I think that's sort of why I came into it. I was very, just excited to see other facets and to meet the people involved. But what I didn't anticipate was this kind of reframing of my brain, especially around stories. You know, I think, I think there were certain like videos that we watched just of like the tropes of stalking tropes. Like I was like, you know, like let's say anything moment with the boombox and the like thinking about what it is actually, what it would actually be like for somebody to come over to your house. There's just, I feel like there are, you know, lessons like that I'm sure you've given many, many times, where you just think about the cultural touchstones that you've grown up with. And that to me, I think as an artist and a theater maker, that to me was like, I mean, really the most, that was the most mind-blowing. Because, you know, I think there are ways that I have thought about gender-based violence and sort of how it shows up, especially like in the law and the Constitution. You know, as you both know, like my husband and I, you know, we had this long affiliation with this play, what the Constitution means to me. So I feel like that sort of, you know, that side of things I understood a little bit better, but I had not spent time thinking a little bit, you know, about the cultural ramifications of some of the stories that are so ingrained in our culture. And so that to me was like the really transformative, that was the really transformative part. And I would say the other really transformative part was just sort of some of the very direct, like learning what to look out for and like learning what to do, you know, because I think we've all, you know, we all have relationships, and we've been with people who are like, I don't like this, I don't love the way this person's behaving, who you're with or who you're in relationship with in some way. And just having like worksheets that were like, this is the behavior, you know, like this is the behavior that you look for. This is how people control other people. And that so much of the issues that we're talking about are about control. They're not necessarily about like sexuality. They're, you know, about the way people control each other. And I think, so that was also just like very mind-blowing. And I think it also, that speaks to the importance of, you know, prevention education. And a lot of the work that WISE is doing is that when you start to be able to, recognize behaviors, know sort of how to intervene, know like how to help people find resources. I think that was also really transformative, because then it became really like direct and personal in my own life, you know, and I could sort of see situations, you know, and just things I'd witnessed in my own life and say, oh, this is how I can help in the future. This is like what I'm looking out for. So I think that would be the second thing that was really, I think, profound about my experience in the training. You know, sort of just coming in really, again, not quite knowing what to expect.
I think there's something like we can get really conceptual around like social change. How do we like shift behaviors? How do we shift our pop culture? And and then there's something really practical about just like, there are tactics that people are using that you can anticipate. And there are prevention strategies that we have decades of research on that work. And like, we could actually do this if people wanted to get on board, which to me is exciting. And every time we do a foundations training, every time we do an event like this and people join, like every time someone sends a video to their colleague or classmate or has a conversation with their kid, like, I just feel like it's getting bigger and the scale are going to tip at some point.
I was driving through West Lebanon, I think it was yesterday, and it was 5:30, and I had WGXL on, and
Shout out Betsy.
Hi, this is Chelsea from WISE, and it was this beautiful segment about, they're all beautiful, but this beautiful segment about talking with a friend if you're concerned that they're in a relationship that is abusive. And you don't have to use the language that we used to let them know that you're concerned and you care for them, and you want to give them the space to really tell you what they're experiencing with their own words. So we don't give advice, right? Like, we're not telling people what to do because of that control that happens so much. And that segment was just the way that the young people were speaking about it was, the ads I know aren't geared toward me, and I've been doing this for 19 years, and that segment was a reminder to me. You know, when you're talking with someone, use their own words. We practice that all the time at WISE. I don't think you stop learning how to do that. I think you just keep practicing how to really hold conversation and give people the space and safety to tell you what's going on in their lives.
Wow.
Yeah, and that's like a perfect transition, because the other kind of theme that kept coming up was how people found the words to describe their experience and the worldview that suddenly like put their life into perspective in so many ways, through like connecting with WISE, through coming together and hearing it from other people. And I also feel like sometimes language can be a real barrier. Like if we're using these big words and talking about like kind of this research framework or academic framework, and people think like, I'm gonna say the wrong word and people are gonna think I'm a bad person, so I'd prefer just to not have that conversation.
Or being afraid to define something, or you know, in a way that feels so, you know, negatively connotated. Like I think I love that. Like it reminds me also of interviewing for the podcast, right? I just like, I don't want to put any words in anyone's mouth. You know, I was like, that's what I was like. This conversation I have to actually talk, but in the podcast I mostly listened. But
you did a wonderful job listening.
But yeah, I love that. I mean, that already is something I'm going to think about. Yeah. That it can be hard to define things, you know, and to really own something before you're ready to emotionally.
Right. And finding a place, I was on a panel with a survivor this morning, And she was saying like she couldn't really wrap her head around what was happening until her therapist said like that's abusive behavior. Like all of the excuses that he's making, it's abusive behavior. And how both like powerful it was for her to be able to use that framework, and also how like so scary it was to say like, oh, this is not something that I have control over to fix. This is something that's happening to me.
And then what?
Yeah.
And then what do you do when you realize that?
Yeah.
Yeah, the next isn't straightforward.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you just got to hear so many people from WISE saying like, I found my people when I came to WISE. Like suddenly I had the words, and I really loved the people who are talking about their high school experience of being like, oh, this is why I feel the way that I do.
Yeah. And that's why, you know, tying it back to community, it's
Right.
like if more people know where they can go and who they can talk to, then I do think, as you said, we stand a chance.
Yeah,
You know?
it's coming.
I was re-listening to your, like, I thought we would have this figured out yet moment in your interview.
Peggy might
there.
remember. I was like this really young upstart coming in being like, so we're gonna end violence, and I kept like working with these like older people in institutions being like, well, I know we're never gonna end violence, but like I think we need to do X, Y, and Z. And I would like come back to why I was just pulling my hair out. Like, don't be in a prevention job if you don't think we can prevent violence.
Well, that's true. That's very true. And look, you've done prevention. Abby Tassel's done prevention. And now you're seeing those students as adults who have kids in the
Doing the
school.
work.
So we are building and creating this broader community of people who understand.
That's amazing.
the
Yeah,
work.
that's something Lizanne said that I was re-listening to the other day. You know, talking also about how, like in this area, like there are people who are like, why wouldn't I know my farmer and like have organic? Really, the opportunity and the exciting opportunity to, through prevention and through everything WISE is doing, to create a community that knows and cares about this and is educating each other. Like the potential for impact feels like immeasurable.
I know. I know. Well, and Jenny and Kate are on too, and I know. And both of them were like how much they've learned from their kids. Like their kids are coming home and being like, "Oh, mom, like we've moved so far past that," which I just really love.
Yeah.
We, speaking from like a different generation, we totally needed to move on from things. We did not understand, and you know, we were raised with different norms than hopefully kids are now, and those norms were not helpful. They were not helpful. They kept things silent. They kept you disconnected from other people because there was a lot of shame and blame involved in the experiences that you had. So I've said, I don't know, Kate, 100 times, I wish Kate and Chelsea had been in school when I was in high school and had done a WISE training.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Things change. I mean, we've talked a little bit about that. You know, it's one of my favorite things about the podcast is seeing how different generations, you know, come into this work. And even now, like I'm just finding, you know, younger folks like have just such a better sense of like boundaries. Like, it's like boundaries, gender fluidity, several things.
Getting
like,
rid of
I
boundaries.
Yeah. I just wish, you know, as I was growing up, you know, I think there were so many things that were so much better, but also, you know, things keep evolving in such a beautiful way. And so, you know, it's been the fun thing about like getting older and at Northern Stage getting to work with, you know, some of the you know, we interviewed Helen Rooker in the podcast, but like generally getting to work with younger folks, you know, in their 20s coming out of WISE prevention programs in their education, and also, you know, just having these sort of new perspectives on so many things.
I think I get excited too. Like it's so exciting when there have been a couple of people now, I did the schools program a long enough time ago that they're like professionals and like joining organizations like WISE, so they get to be colleagues now. But I also really love, Helen going to work at Northern Stage, which like, you know, theoretically has nothing to do with it, and yet still can find all of these places where that information is impacting their life. And that to me is like, you don't have to work at WISE. You don't have to do this as your job to still be moved and a part of this collective that's decided it's going to change for us. Yeah.
And really, isn't that the opportunity? The ask of people is, it's not really about joining staff or the wonderful board or even being a volunteer, but having some curiosity about what's this issue and what's interesting for me about this issue, so I can be in my own community of people and start to create that small conversation by conversation change. We know it can happen.
I remember people when I started being like, oh, I'd love to be involved with WISE, but I can't do the crisis line. Like, that's not for me. And so I think for a long time, prevention felt like this high bar that you had to meet. Like, unless I'm ready to make a certain level of commitment, I'm not going to get involved. I actually remember a guidance counselor in a parent meeting we were doing saying, like, if you're not going to be in it with that student forever, like, don't even broach the subject. So I think it felt for a really long time like overwhelming, and only those people who were super passionate were going to be able to make a difference. And I'm loving the way that everyone's just, Abby says in her podcast, like, we just have to try. We just have to wake up and try together, and everyone's going to do it a little bit differently. And that's
okay.
Great. Yeah. Perfect, actually. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that. I was just re-listening to that recently. I love that part because it also, it also takes the burden off to some extent.
Right.
That, like, some days you wake up and you're like, am I, she said, like, am I the best person to do this? Can I do this? And it's beautiful to think that, no, you're on a team and you're on a team that's proliferating. And so, you can have those moments of doubt. You cannot know it's funny, both you and Abby, I think, talk about not knowing and that being okay, and I think that also is such an incredible part of WISE's power is your just constant willingness to reinvent and to try new things.
There's some gutsiness involved, for sure.
Yeah.
But it's not blind gutsiness. It's not being bold for the sake of boldness. It's saying, some things aren't working. Let's try and change it up. Let's try and see. And sometimes something clicks, and that's a beautiful thing.
And that we can do that because everything we do is from what we learn from our community. Everything that we do is because our community has said, this is what we need, this is what is not working. So we've been able to be gutsy and bold because, like, we know we have this whole body behind us. It's not just WISE. It's not just maybe this will work. It's based on this huge group of people.
And survivors trusting us with their stories, with their lives. And they're all unique and they're all powerful, and they really teach us about where we can be bold and take some chances, because gosh knows they're doing it in some very profound ways. Is there a chat?
Yeah, Stan is saying it takes patience, and that we have patience and persistence, and they're working.
Aww.
Yeah, as executive director of WISE, I have to say that there's nothing like an advocate wanting something.
Persistence-wise.
Persistence and patience. They don't give up. Honestly, no's not an option. And I think that's a good thing, right? Because we need to create change. There are things that aren't working, and if someone is saying no, even if I'm saying no, maybe I need to examine why it's a no. And that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to change.
Yeah.
Patience and persistence.
Yeah, there you go.
Amazing.
And that, like, earnestly, like, the opportunities that we have don't always take a huge investment. That I think it was maybe Jenny and Kate who put it most specifically, but, like, listening and believing is what people need. And even if that's our first step, even if that's what every person in our community can commit to, is just listening and believing when survivors are telling us about their experience, when people are talking about the things in our culture that aren't working for them anymore or that make them less safe. Everyone can do that if we want to.
I think, you know, when you do listen, you make a choice whether you're going to be complicit with the way things are structured.
Yeah.
Or whether you're going to work towards changing it.
Yeah. The Peggy O'Neill, like, pick your team.
Pick your team.
Aw, I like that.
Yeah. Yep.
Leanne's in the chat saying it's important. Like, we're on a team. We are a team. We picked it. Yeah. And then I think pick a team in a way that's not necessarily us against them, but like in a sense of like, we are going to overcome. Like, we're gonna be persuasive. We're gonna convince people that this vision is better than what you're clinging to.
And truly, you know, Stan saying patient, like, it's the long view. It's the very long view. There's no choice.
Right.
Yeah.
I think there's no choice. Like,
There's no choice, yeah.
people are suffering and we are going to be with them and like while that's happening.
Yeah.
So this is, I feel like, some of the sense of mission that I've observed in action. You know, yeah. I mean, I just think it is beautiful, and it is, I don't know. Sorry, I just wanted to, I was like, not to call it up, but just like, yeah, both of your passion for this mission. And like, I mean, again, the patience and persistence, that is one of the things I feel like, one of the chief things I noticed in talking to folks who had dedicated, you know, significant time and resources from their lives to WISE is that, yeah, I mean, that absolute dedication. I feel like I want to just like bottle the last few minutes and just, you know, take them with me forever, because I think that, I don't know, I think that to me is what, I know enlivens the people around you, enlivens the community to sort of act with WISE and on behalf of WISE, and to sort of internalize this mission as their own, hopefully.
I mean, Peggy and I are both oldest children too, so like the sense of fairness is strong with us. And like,
Same, actually.
Because it wasn't fair as the first child.
Yeah,
It
and
was not fair.
Sometimes people are like, oh yeah, like passion's one word for it, but it just has always felt to me like, but this is unfair. So like, how do we rest while there is something unfair happening?
Why do my siblings get to do
I
that?
can't let it go.
never
Oh my
could do
Yeah.
that.
I can't let it go. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah, and the asks, I think, can seem complicated. I've been having these conversations with area therapists about a different podcast, but about sort of a sexual assault scenario where the friends responded in a way that wasn't disbelieving, but ultimately made it so that they were picking the side of the perpetrator. Like, it was too hard to sit with themselves and think about, like, what does it mean that we're letting this survivor just feel like all of her friends are gone? And it's been really powerful to think about, you know, a lot of us feel like, oh, it's not that we disbelieve them. There's two sides. We're not picking sides. We're just being neutral. Like, you all can make your own decisions, and how that practically plays out so that the survivor didn't have a community. And so the listen and believe thing just keeps coming back to me, because it like adds this like understand. It's not just like listening. Yeah, I hear you. I hear what you said he did, but also this like, you have to do something. You have to.
Yeah, the listening and believing is not trite. It's not like language that it's not our messaging.
Yeah.
It literally means if you're listening and believing that what this person is telling you is the experience they've had, it changes everything. And that most of us have to learn how to do, because, at least speaking for myself, the default is, well, maybe it wasn't that bad, or he still loves you, or you know, maybe you're just going through a rough patch. I mean, there's all these sort of different ways of explaining away, behavior that is just really harmful for people.
Yeah.
And what it says to the survivor is, I just have to keep enduring it.
Yeah.
At what cost?
Right. And it's not this like trite, like, oh, we believe every person, everything that they've ever said because no one ever lies. It's believing that people we know and care about can do harmful things, and believing that someone can be a good person and also have done really horrific violence. And like believing that we have power to say, I love and care about you and what you did was not okay. Like believing that we have the power to say with a survivor, like, I'm just going to sit with you for as long as you need and figure this out with you. Like the belief is just so much bigger than this, oh, is it an investigation?
Yeah.
Is it true or not?
Exactly.
I think there's something that came up a couple of times in the podcast and in some of the interviews that was also something that really struck me, which was this idea that some of these ideas can be difficult to grasp because they do require accountability, and they do, they require potentially sort of admitting that like the systems that are set up are, maybe set up to benefit me.
Yeah.
And, in order to sort of change the system, maybe I have to change some of my behavior, or maybe I have to, change the way I think about things. And that can be, that can be difficult to grasp.
Yeah.
I love that. I felt like that came up in a couple of different episodes, and I think that was very profound to me too, because that can, that can be applied to a lot of different, movements for social change that we all need to sort of push forward.
Isn't that what the power and control is about?
Yeah. Yeah.
There's only so much power and so much control, so
We have to fight with each other
you have to
about
fight
it.
with each other to get
Exactly.
it. And that's not really true.
And that's why I'm so I'm interested and excited by what you both talk about the sort of joy of this movement, and about just sort of trying to tap into the how can reframing things be a sort of joyful and exciting and interesting process, rather than one that feels like, oh well, what am I I'm giving something up, what do I get? And I think the idea is what you get is
humanity.
Exactly. It's everyone's full humanity.
Yeah.
And how awesome does that sound?
Yeah,
and I think that, I don't know, I'm so, again, as a storyteller, I'm so interested in that, and that part of the podcast really also made an impact on me, thinking about, thinking about how to reframe that story for people so that it's less what do I have to give up, and more what's the world we want to create? I think there's some point, I think I said this was totally inspired by Betsy, it is about creating, hi Betsy, more about creating a more peaceful world. And I was like, that's, when you put it that way, sounds great, and I think that reframing, anyway, through the podcast and sort of listening a little bit to people grapple with what some of the obstacles have been and what some of the difficulties have been, it's just, trying to reframe the journey in those terms was very transformative and interesting to me.
Yeah.
It seems like I'm so excited to hear you say this. I almost hear you say that, as a storyteller, as someone who is going to get a Tony Award someday.
Oh,
right?
thank you.
Yes, you are. That there's this discernment that you're developing about storytelling and what kind of stories you want to tell and how you want to tell them through this, short-term experience that you've had with WISE. And I think that's hugely humbling and exciting.
Definitely.
So, yeah.
I think theater has so many different capacities, and I will say, I do still believe in it as a place to show what not to, sort of where people struggle to connect, where people, struggle to make things happen. But I also think that theater is, a place where you can really envision a different future. And I think that, that's absolutely been so inspired by my time with WISE, and something I am thinking a lot more about the stories that I'm telling and putting out there.
And the experience that people have being in a theater together and having the experience of the production, and that's transformative.
Yeah.
Can be just transformative.
There's studies that say people's hearts start beating together. Yeah, I really believe that's the thing that I passionately, obsessively believe in. And I think there is a lot of capacity for storytelling, and I think a lot of, I think as someone who, I'm like the daughter of therapists, and I think a lot about theater is like just a laboratory to understand how people work,
It is.
and that's and also one of the reasons I loved doing the podcast and the interviewing is because I guess I didn't realize that about myself as much until I sort of sat down and interviewed all these people, and I was like, oh yeah, this is why I'm in it anyway, is to get to know people, to get to know what makes them tick and like what makes them, excited, and hearing their life stories is just endlessly fascinating to me. So
You made it so easy to be interviewed, for sure.
Thank you.
Yeah, for sure.
But it was definitely, it was a new dimension for me of storytelling that I loved.
I mean, I think too, like, it just makes sense because it's going to take some creativity. Like, like the status quo, what we know without thinking critically about it just like gets absorbed. And without like creativity, we're just going to keep repeating the same thing over and over again. And so this like theater, other storytellers, other artists are like giving us a way to go completely off road. I did a conversation with Sherry Beauchert recently about her book on Title IX, and kind of her protagonist who started the quest for non-discrimination based on sex was like, I didn't recognize that's what I was experiencing because discrimination was just like the clothes that we wear. It was like getting dressed in the morning. And it just seems so important that we're able to start thinking about like, it could be different because how we live now is unimaginable to people who lived before us.
Yeah.
So like what's coming next is unimaginable except for all of these ways that we're being creative.
I love that thought. I had never really heard it articulated that way, but it's true. If somebody woke up today, they might be like, what? Yeah, like, how are you living?
I know.
Yeah. And how could we envision what that could be in the future?
Yeah.
My first job out of college was, I had an interview, and literally, no exaggeration, I was told to stand up, turn around so they could see what I looked like. And I did, right? Because you need a job. So.
It's like my jaw has to come
I know.
up.
But that, as Kate said, that was, it was a little weird, but it wasn't, I didn't have language, I didn't have context. Abby's always talking about context. I didn't have that then. I needed a job.
Yeah.
So I was going to do as I was told.
Yeah.
And I did.
Yeah.
Wow.
Trisha's saying that she loved in the podcast Pat Glowa's vision of the better world, and I remember saying to you, like, Pat says like, well, that's my fantasy. I'm like, what is fantasy about this?
know,
You're
like,
literally just saying people deserve to like be
just
safe.
in like the perfect Pat
Yes.
tone that I just loved. Oh God.
Yeah.
It was so perfect. Yeah.
Izzy is saying, if the podcast could have had more episodes, what other stories or what other people would you have wanted to interview or make up? Yeah.
Well, that's a great question. I mean, I already was, I was sad because I felt like we sort of came up with a certain number of episodes, and I feel like the last episode was a little bit split. Like, so I still want to do the Peggy special. I've done 2 interviews. I want to do a third. I've because anyway, I feel like Peggy's, her story and also just the journey of watching WISER grow for over 20 years. So that's still in my dream is a bigger Peggy special. And also Kate, I feel like, the folks who I got to interview sort of to give some context to what I was learning about the history of WISE. So I guess that's really more like bring us into the present of WISE. I think that would be amazing. I'd love to talk also more to Kate about her long-term work with WISE and just really be able to use your story. You're here. You're right here. Your story. I don't have to talk about you in the third person. Also because it's just really inspiring, and I want the world to know that you initially wanted to be a radio DJ, and there's just like there's a lot more to cover now.
Yeah.
So I think those for sure, and other than that, I just know, so many people have been involved. Like I even know, Carol Dunn, our artistic director at Northern Stage, is such a strong female leader. I know also her husband Peter Hackett has worked a lot with WISE. That is also sort of a dream interview I wanted to do, but it's hard to keep it to 6 episodes because as we would say, there's so many people who have been involved, and I'm sure you two probably have people to talk to, but those are just a few that I know that were sort of on my wish list. And
before the pandemic, we were able to offer people to sit in a prevention program class and take it all in, and I could see that could be a podcast where Izzy is in a classroom and you or Kate are in the back and sort of taking it all in for a podcast, because that's a fascinating experience.
I just also always love when we've gone to Kendall and hearing the stories of people, another question from Celine was what was different 50 years ago that WISE is impacting now? And Abby's saying survivor experiences before WISE and now that WISE exists, dramatically different. And I just have loved hearing their stories. And I also really love whenever a parent comes back and says well, guess what my kid did because of the schools program, or someone comes back and says I did foundation and here's how I applied it. And just people who maybe aren't, again, staff or board or volunteers, but just have these little fingerprints on WISE and then how that spirals out. I think those are always really interesting and uplifting.
Absolutely. There could be something that was really more about we could
interview
20 different people and just say what sticks with you from the training, and even that would be just an interesting. Love doing some montages in the podcast. Really good montage. Thanks
some
to
Rocky music.
Alec Diva for his montages.
Yeah. I also think about our writing group, which has been going on for such a long time, and all of the folks that have gone through that, and what they're producing with their writing and the storytelling that they're giving. And there's probably, if the viewers don't pick up, I'm definitely pitching more podcasts in the future. So, because there's so much more to tell, and all kidding aside, I do think that this medium is a medium that WISE is really interested in getting more adept at, so that we can use this to bring more people into the conversation, because people will get sick of hearing from me pretty soon. So we need more people involved in the conversation.
Yeah, and it's so accessible. This was my, really sort of my first time working in the medium, but you can listen in your car. They're usually free. There's just something about the storytelling that makes the storytelling just so immediate and accessible that I really loved. And, you can be taking a walk, especially during a pandemic, I found it such a wonderful source of going outside of yourself at a time that you were sort of trapped inside.
And then I'm a talker thinker, so I'm great, I listen to a podcast, but I need to talk to somebody about it. We need to have this conversation. And Stan's actually saying what are the plans for developing groups of allies, groups of people who just want to have this conversation more. And I think there's so much opportunity for that. And as we think more about we want to be having more intentional conversations with our communities, because some of us are really lucky to be able to be out in the community talking about this all the time. And how can we make that accessible and visible and participatory in a different way, so that people can hear it and then do it.
It's a conversation, and it's also being in relationship with each other.
Right.
I think about the experience that Alex and Martha had in those early days of WISE, sitting on the floor in Hanover. And we don't necessarily do that as a staff at WISE, but we do, because, for those who are familiar with our building, the PEP office, Prevention Education Office, has this black chair in it, and inevitably, we'll end up there to just chat with each other about what's going on today, but also what's going on in the world. And some of those conversations have created some of the work we're doing now.
Wow.
Because that's where that creativity is. Why don't we try and do this? So if we can, love to talk with Stan about this, how we can create space for conversation and also to be in relationship with each other. 'Cause it's not a once and done, right? It's,
Right.
It's
I love
evolved. It's
that.
evolved.
Stan's being put on notice that he's going to get
He's
hooked
on notice,
in.
Stan.
I feel like, yeah, I mean, there are challenges to that in this moment in time, you know, but yeah, like having a conversation like this with an audience and some snacks, and I feel like we'd get it started,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah.
And right now, like comments are not nothing. I think that
They're
is
coming
like,
in.
that is conversation, and that is, you know, well, we can keep in touch and pay attention with who's here tonight, and I feel like
Yeah,
that's
maybe
the
we can have
beginning,
enough. That's right.
you know?
There you go. Yep.
Yeah.
And Lizanne is saying that, like, she listened to the Lizanne, who's someone who's been involved with Wise like since the
long time.
90s, was listening to the podcast and learned about this collaboration that we have with restorative justice and how incredible that is, and like how really groundbreaking it is. There's been really decades of controversy about whether or not or how restorative or transformational justice intersect with gender-based violence. So she's like, how are we publicizing this more? How do people stay in the know?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
I think it's definitely something we should talk about more, and you know, would love for Abby to be chiming in here. It's also early days. What we're doing is a pilot. We're trying it out. Abby's learning from it with the folks at the Community Justice Center. So we definitely want to be sharing more about it, and I think we're still very much in a learning period about how this works, because what we want is to realize the potential of restorative justice in the circles of peace, and not and just be careful that it's what works for survivors. And I think we're still figuring that out.
Yeah. Can I ask a little question just
Yeah.
about that, sort of related to the innovation? So when you have an idea like this, like let us sort of try and use these restorative justice frameworks, what's usually like the process? Do you have like a sort of, a process for trying a new idea, sort of trying it over time, trying something new?
I think for me, it's two things. One is, everyone that works at WISE has these incredible strengths, and they want to try new things. So supporting that. And then in this case, it was both Abby Tassel as well as Dave Cahill, the former state's attorney in Windsor County, who said, we want to hold people that have caused harm accountable, and I don't think we're able to move this through prosecution. So are there ways that we can do that? And he, as I remember, and I may be misrepresenting him, he knew of a program that's based on a Native American process, and he said, can we try it? And he brought it to WISE. He brought it to the Restorative Justice Center. And then, Abby worked with the Vermont Domestic Violence Council, honestly, to get approval, because right now it's prohibitive to use restorative justice for domestic violence cases. So we're figuring it out and learning a lot. And that might be a wonderful podcast as well, to have a conversation with Abby and folks at the CJC and learn about what's going on with that. But, I think the broader view is the criminal legal system doesn't work for many survivors. It's not meant to work for many survivors, and prison isn't the solution. Can't keep putting people in prison. They eventually come back out, right? So we want people to be in community with us. And as Kate said earlier, you can cause harm and we can still care for you. So finding that balance, we're trying to figure it out.
So amazing, yeah. Interesting.
We're almost at an hour. It's
Yeah.
like
What?
flown by.
Are you kidding?
Yeah. So 2 seconds to see if people have like final questions or thoughts in the chat. And like, if you have things you're like, oh, I can't believe I haven't asked this or said this. And then we're going to thank folks.
Wow.
I know.
To go back through my mental notes.
Yeah, I'm just very thankful that we had this experience, and thankful to
I
Northern
know.
Stage.
Well, I'm glad this is, yeah, and I'm glad this was such a flowing conversation that I did not,
Lost all.
I had no idea. I had lost all track of time.
Good.
But yeah, I just feel the same way. I mean, I feel so lucky that Peggy came to Carol, a few years ago, and that, I got the lucky job of working with, everyone here and all of you out there in the community. It's been amazing.
Yeah. Abby's reminding us that restorative justice is for survivors too, everyone who wants to find a way to feel pulled back and supported by a community when they feel like
Well
they
put.
may have been pushed out. So thanks for the reminder.
Thank you.
Thanks again to Northern Stage, especially you, Jess and Alec, and your colleagues that helped with the production. Thanks for being here with us tonight.
Pleasure.
Thanks to Mascoma Bank, who sponsored the podcast so that we were able to do it. And to you all, thank you so much for joining us. To all of the podcast participants, our future is going to be what our community needs. So stay in touch. We're going to keep having conversations, being in the community, available. Resources, support, contact information are all on our website. Ways to stay informed about what's next at WISE. We have a newsletter that's chock full of information every month, wiseuv.org.
Future podcasts.
And a future podcast. You heard it here first.
Yeah.
You're not alone. We're in this together. So thank you all for being with us, and have a good night.
Yeah.